Welcome everyone. This is the Cities and Knights Masterclass. I'm Bludz. Probably know me, but if you don't know me, I am a frequent player in the Barbarian division in Catan Championship League. I have won the Barbarian division twice, so I'm not here to brag. That's more just my qualifications to be able to give you some tips. And so this class is actually going to be an intermediate level class. I'm going to assume you know the mechanics of the game. You've played Cities and Knights. I'm not going to go over like the basics of like how the game works or anything. This is going to be like a little more, intermediate to advanced strategy, a lot of tips. So anyway, without further ado, let us get started. And let's see today's agenda. So there's three kind of like larger topics that I want to cover. The first is the phases of the game. And so in Cities and Knights, unlike base, there's actually 3 phases instead of 2. So first is your placement. Second phase is the first barbarian wave, which is actually slightly different than the remainder of the game. And then we're going to talk about the remainder of the game kind of in the context of progress card tips. Largely, that's going to be a lot of the meat. The first 2 pieces are going to be kind of the meat of the presentation. And then the commodities and general strategies is going to be kind of a shorter section at the end. Just a couple things I wanted to go over that I think are important that you might not have thought about or you might, find insightful. So anyway, let's continue on, and we're just going to start with placements. So one of the important things to know in Cities and Knights, as opposed to the base game, is balancing resource ratios is not nearly as important. Like in base, you want to be kind of producing a similar ratio of wheat and ore so that you can build cities or pop devs together. In C&K, it's like not as important because progress cards allow you to kind of supplement your resource production, whether you're pulling resource monopolies to grab resources from others to supplement your own production, or you're using merchants and things like that to be able to port more efficiently. And so overproducing one resource can actually be really powerful. And there's a few reasons for this. I'll talk about this at other points, but particularly wheat, wood, and sheep, as they are the most common resources on the board, are pretty useful to be able to overproduce. I would say in general, brick is probably the least important resource in Cities and Knights, just because there's no commodity associated with it, and the commodities are very important. And furthermore, while wheat also doesn't have a commodity associated with it, it's probably still like the most overall useful resource. Activating knights, building cities, building settlements, still very important. In the beginning of the game, like getting on a commodity track is important. If you're overproducing one resource, you could 4-1 for that. You can 4-1 to build a knight to save your city. If you're pulling merchants, you can definitely start 2-1ing that one resource that you produced a lot of. It's actually possible to play a 2-resource game in C&K. I think wheat sheep is probably the strongest, but there are others that are doable. I've seen it done with a few different 2-resource combinations, and it kind of relies on pulling some good monopolies and merchants and some other good progress cards. But yeah, so you don't have to worry about balancing your resource ratios. And then the second thing for placements that I would say is you want to set up that both can kind of build a knight and activate to save your city from the barbarians in the beginning, but also has this like staying power that you have this long-term growth potential. So you could choose a city that is going to be you could choose a city or a setup that's going to be very safe, and you're definitely going to save your city, but then you don't really ever gain a lot of momentum going through the game, and you're not able to kind of close out. Or alternatively, you could choose a setup that looks really powerful, but it's you can't save your city in the beginning, and then once it burns, you have trouble rebuilding it, and then you're never able to really get off the ground. Another thing I'll point out, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit, is port setup. I've seen this. Let's say you're in the 4th position and you get this like really uber powerful like wood city where you're making like tons of wood. You're going to get the aqueduct very quickly, and you're not sure where to put your settlement. I've seen players put their settlement on a wood port so they can be more flexible. And I think this can work, like if the wood port is a good producing spot itself, say it was like an 8-10 wood port, I think that's viable. But I've seen people put their settlement on something like a 4-11. And I'm not saying this can't win games. Like it can win games, but when you build the second city, you're not going to get that second wind. And so you're really relying on that first city. You're going to have a lot of players kind of colluding against you, and I've noticed that these kind of setups often, if there's like proper collusion against them, there will be you will kind of start to flag around 9 or 10 points, and you'll sort of have trouble finishing it. So, when I say you want long-term growth potential, make sure your first settlement is also a spot that when you city it up, it kind of gives you that second wind, kind of helps you, progress your game or really get your game off the ground as well. Another thing with placements, I think locking the board is a bit more important in Cities and Knights than in the base game, and just like not leaving 3 hex spots, like really strong 3 hex spots for people. There's a couple reasons for this. I think the first one, Cities and Knights, I think, there's a lot more going on, and so in a sense, there's a higher skill ceiling of like understanding everything that goes on in the game, but there's also a lot more luck in the game, and so there are a lot of games where one player will just steamroll or just, jump ahead and, become an unstoppable train. And if you leave these 3 hex spots open in the middle and they get one, they might get another, and then, who's stopping them? So, you want to think about that, and you also want to think about preventing your opponents from getting really strong cities. Like if you're taking a city that's like maybe not quite as good, but you're locking, what would have been 3 strong spots, this is like generally a good strategy, I'd say. And then also you want to think about, and this is a similar concept to what you'll see in like base Catan, is aiming for a less contested path to victory. So very popularly, people will place their cities on wood because they want to get the aqueduct very strong, and so there'll be kind of like this competition for the science metropolis. Maybe you want to place your city on sheep, and maybe you have like the only really strong sheep spot, and you kind of get into a lead on that trade metropolis. You're going to have an easier time, getting that 2 points, that explosive play, and you can kind of like play the rest of your game on its own. You don't have to kind of sink resources into competing with somebody. Yeah, and then, so actually, I took a board here this is from Catanapalooza, and this game was between Trissy, Donkey Kong, Rayman, and A-Rod, and I thought this was a cool board, so I just wanted to discuss a little bit. I think I could do like a whole class just on placement, so I'm not actually going to place out this board and think say how I think it should have been placed, but I want to just talk about what I'm seeing on this board and like what are good spots, and kind of just discuss that. So the first spot that stands out to me is the 6-3-9 on the left with wood or. It's the strongest wood spot on the board. It's also the strongest ore spot on the board. You have 2 hexes of ore. So even if you don't get a good wheat spot on the way back, you're likely to be able to get some wheat trades. And when you get that second city up, which again, you're making a lot of ore, it's going to be likely you're going to have the best paper production. You're going to have the best coin production. This just looks like a really strong spot. The 6-9-5 also looks like a good spot. You have a good wood brick ratio. You have a 3-to-1 port. The 5 and the 9 are both good commodity spots when you do city up. That said, your starting spot having no wheat and no ore might be a little dicey, because those spots do tend to go at a premium, and you might not get a great one on the way back. So just something to consider there. This 8-5-10 with the 2 sheep and the wheat at the bottom is also a very strong spot. The ports are not so good, but again, this is a spot that you're going to have the best wheat on the board, the best sheep. Once you city this up, you're not going to have a lot of trouble, contesting that cloth metro probably. You're going to be in charge in terms of that. And now here's sort of a wrinkle, I think, where like in a base game, perhaps someone would take the 8-4-10 up top, but in C&K here, it's the 5-4-10 actually is more important. The brick is kind of plentiful on the board already. And then that wood spot is like really good, especially if you get a city on it, the second best wood spot. And furthermore, if you take 4-5-10, you point to the 8-10. This 8-10 spot is always going to be open for you. I think it's always going to be open. I don't think it's ever going to be taken. So you get a really strong expansion spot where you're doubling up your ore. You're getting on a good brick spot. This 5-4-10 is like high key, like a really, really strong spot on the board. And then some other strong city spots that they're not, 10 plus pips of production, but the 4-9-11 or 10-9-11, I would say like I have a preference for the 10-9-11. It's a little more board locking. You get all 3 commodity resources, which is generally a really strong city. Obviously, you would kind of prefer for the 9 to be wood rather than ore, but it's still strong. It's still going to be a very strong city. And then something I want to talk about. So I don't want to go into the analysis of the game. It was actually a great game. in the game, Rayman actually took 4-9-11 instead of 10-9-11. And I think, there were a few reasons for this, and it fit his play style. And so I'm not here to criticize the pick, but I actually want to point something out that some players might not be super familiar with. So let's say you take 4-9-11, you point down. In base games, you're kind of, you're at risk of this 10-3-11, plowing you, right? But in C and K, there's actually a second way to get plowed, and the 10-9-2 actually does a very similar job, because when you place on the 10-9-2, you get ore and sheep, and so you can place a starting knight, which you can then put on top of, like when you're in a road race, you can put it on top of their road, and only you can pass through. Now, it's not quite as powerful as, building the road directly, because, if you take too long, your knight can get crushed, or your opponent can pull an intrigue and destroy it, and then reverse plow you. But it's still something to consider when you're making your placements and you're pointing your roads. Like, you can get plowed in this game. That's actually what happened. Fritzy placed on the 2-9-10, got to the 3-10-11, and he actually did get the longest road. So that was an important, thing to talk about. Again, don't want to criticize the pick. Rayman got to 12 points. It was a close game, or he got to 11 or 12 points. But yeah, just something to point out. And then also, I think the other spots that stand out to me are both of the 8-3-4s. The 8-3-4 on the bottom right and the 8-3-4 on the top left. They're both decent spots. They're going to be picked. They're both very low, commodity production spots. So neither one's really a great city. But they do have some pros to them. The top left one, you get these good 3-1 ports. You can double up your 8, double up your 3. You do get ore wheat. Even if it's a weak ore spot, you can always draw cards like mining. And then the 8-3-4 on the bottom, the ore port's not so great, but the wheat port's pretty good. If you point to it, you are risking getting cut off by 3-6-11, although that's not a great spot. So you might not get cut off there. But yeah, I kind of just wanted to talk about the board and how I'm looking at what each spot means, and how we think about it in terms of commodity production versus when you look at a board in base. I'm kind of talking about these spots standalone, and yeah, you want your spots to kind of the resources to coordinate, but having overproduction is okay. So taking the 6-3-9 and then not really having a lot of wheat, that's okay for sure. Anyway, yeah, I want to move on to the next phase of the game, which is the first barbarian attack. And this is a little bit different than the rest of the game, really in one way, and that's that the robber will not move when you roll 7. And that's kind of the defining characteristic of this phase of the game. The robber won't move. It can't be bounced off of the desert with an active knight or moved with the bishop card either. So there's a couple things that this kind of changes. So the first is that 7ing out is a little more devastating than usual, because you don't get to rob somebody to get an extra card back after you throw away half your hand. And then the second thing is no resource hexes can be blocked, so you have access to all your rolls, which is really nice. And so every resource that you can produce, you don't have to worry about being blocked. And so the main kind of objective of this phase is to build an activated knight to maintain your city. And the reason for that is, well, cities, it's called cities and knights for a reason. But you need cities to produce commodities, and commodities are sort of the most important piece in cities and knights. Drawing progress cards is sort of the lifeblood of, your economy and how you're going to progress in the game. So when you lose your city, your big priority is going to be rebuild it. So usually you want to just try to save it in the beginning. And so this first phase is often getting up your infrastructure, get that first knight and activate it. And you can do a few things. You can build a second city. This puts extra pressure on other players to build a second knight or something, because if everyone's city burns but you have a second city, you get to keep one, you're in the lead, right? And then if you can't save your city, make a contingency plan to rebuild. Whether that is, my general suggestion is get on some commodity tracks, particularly the yellow track, but I'll talk about that. Yellow and green, and then blue. Try to get on some commodity tracks. But you can do other things, you can build to a port, you can build to another 3-1 hex to get your production up. You could try to secure some trades. And going into that trade, I think, when you make your first placement, you don't necessarily need to be on sheep, wheat, and ore. Ore is still very good in cities and knights, but it's probably not as quite of a premium as it is in the base game, because there's a lot more ways to kind of generate it. You just have a higher production overall, so it's easier to like port and generate ore. There's more monopolies. There's cards like mining, like medicine, and I think it's okay to place on just wheat and sheep, but it's also you could place on ore and wheat and not have sheep. And so one of the things you want to do is, obviously, if you're overproducing, something I talked about before, you can 4-to-1 for a resource make that you don't normally produce, or you can 4-to-1 for a commodity and hope that that helps you. Maybe you'll pull a merchant and then you can start 2-to-1ing. But also you can find a trading partner. And there's a few ways you can do this. You might be on sheep and not on ore. Other person's on ore, not on sheep. You trade ore for a sheep. Win-win. You both save your city, right? But there are more complicated things you can do. For example, maybe both of you have your wheat and your sheep, and you both need ore, but neither of you makes it. But say they have 3 wood and a brick, and you have 3 brick and a wood. Well, you just swap, and you each get a 4-to-1, and you both save your cities. So just some things to think about. Like, you can really cooperate with players. You can also do things like trade a player to upgrade their knight to save your city. And I'm going to get into that in a second. Actually, I jumped ahead on that. But one thing to consider is if your city's already safe and other people are trying to save their city and you have what they need, consider charging them a high price. You don't want to try to charge too high of a price, because someone else might undercut your deal if they also have that. So you need to be aware and tracking of like what players have. But if someone has like a pretty strong city, you can charge them a commodity or a commodity and a card to save their city. But you also have to use your judgment. Like, this comes with experience. Sometimes someone's city is just like too powerful, and like the asking price is just something they're not going to want to pay. You're going to have to sort of determine that for yourself. I can't give you a lesson on that. But definitely try to get some value out of that if you're like saving somebody's city. And to go back to, ways you can, secure your saves. One thing is, if you generate a commodity and your city's in danger, I would recommend do not use that commodity right away, because maybe you'll need to trade it to save your city. And you might think, well, I'm trading a commodity. They're so useful. Maybe it'll help me rebuild my city. But if you save your city with that commodity, you're going to roll more of that commodity. It's an investment on your future, And I think it's usually going to be worth it to do so, depending on like the strength of your city or the strength of your ore wheat game. And if you have trouble rebuilding, saving your city is more important. And then paying someone else to build a level 2 knight, so save your city. There's an important distinction I want to make here, and that's if they build a level 2 knight, that's good. If they build a second level 1 knight, that's not as good for you for a couple reasons. The main reason is, on the next orbit, you'll still have to go build your knight and activate. Whereas if they built a level 2 knight, when they activate that, you're safe again the next orbit, potentially, right? And so it gives you a little more flexibility. The other thing is, you have to be careful of other players. If they're close to a city and you're paying someone to upgrade their knight or build a second knight, that's only going to save them. That's still not going to save you. So you need to be like kind of aware of those dynamics going on. And I want to talk a little bit about like if you lose your city and what commodities and like what strategies to rebuild. So as I've said, I believe that the trade track, the yellow cards, are probably the most helpful for getting back in the game. This isn't to say the green ones aren't good. Obviously, the blue ones are not going to help as much. With the green cards, you do have cards like mining, irrigation, medicine. These cards are very good for rebuilding your city, but you could be playing an oreless game. You could be playing a wheatless game. And in those cases, an irrigation or mining might not be helpful to you. Obviously, medicine is always going to be great. But I just want to talk a little bit about the cards that won't help you, and so we can kind of just like do some quick mental math here. So when you don't have a city, the 2 cards from the yellow deck that won't help you are Commercial Harbor and Commodity Monopoly. Now, there are exceptions. You could use a Commodity Monopoly and make a trade that helps you get your city back, but in general, it's not going to be as helpful, right? Not directly. And then for the green cards, Engineer, Crane, Printer, not useful. So that's 4 out of 18 for both. But I think some of the other cards in the green deck, like the Smith, it's not a bad card, but it's not helping you rebuild your city. And the Inventor, maybe it could, but that you inventor doesn't roll, like you don't know. Whereas with the yellow cards, you get merchants, merchant fleets, master merchants, resource monopolies. There are 4 resource monopolies in the deck, and 6 merchants. And being able 2-to-1 to, create some ore or create some wheat, very useful. And then resource monopoly is probably the big one. And the reason this one is so important, I think, is because when you've lost your city, other players are kind of like gaining ground on you. They're sort of like making their lead over you a little bigger. And a resource monopoly is like taking stuff away from them and giving it to you. So it sort of helps you catch up faster than the green cards, which don't hurt your opponents even if they're helping you. So that's why I recommend, like, if you think your city's going to burn, you have to 4-for-1 for a commodity beforehand. I would recommend cloth over paper. That is just my general recommendation. I think there are times when the green cards are going to help you more. It's obviously situational. This is sort of a generalized talk on that. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I want to talk about progress cards. And I was talking about before, I think the yellow cards, the trade track, are generally going to be the most useful. This isn't to say, like, oh, yellow cards are always better than green cards. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they're kind of more flexible in their use, where they're going to be useful in more types of situations. Monopoly is like pretty much always a good card. Merchants may not always be the best card, but they're super powerful in the end game. They're good in the beginning for kind of getting yourself off the ground. Whereas some of the green cards, again, irrigation, mining, can be great cards if you're on, multiple wheat and ore hexes. But if you're not on one of those hexes, kind of useless. Medicine might not be helpful if you already have 4 cities or you have 2 cities and no settlements. Might not be so useful. So they're a little more situational. I think generally, like, if I were to have an ideal hand, I'd want like 2 yellows, 2 greens, and you can kind of use the yellows in their flexibility to get the most out of your green cards, right? And I'm going to talk more about card combinations, but that's just what I would say. Like, obviously people put a lot of emphasis on how good the aqueduct is, and the science track is great. But I think like the trade track gets a little bit overlooked in that, and the resource monopolies and merchants are just like really powerful. Master merchant's also a great card. So I would say don't confuse the aqueduct for the science track card, because they're 2 different things. And this isn't to say like science track cards aren't good. They can be very good too. And actually I'm going to talk about right now what I think the strongest cards are overall. And the 5 cards, I think, generally within, over the course of games and games and games, obviously there are going to be situations where other cards have huge impact. But I think the Spy, that's a card where you take another progress card from someone else. That's huge, right? The best politics card, in my opinion. It's huge. It can stop someone from winning the game if you take away their merchant or their alchemist or something. Or it could be game winning for you. You pull a road building from somebody else and you suddenly just have road. The merchant, that flexibility to 2-to-1 one of your resources, but also that extra victory point at the end is huge for closing games. Resource monopoly, I don't think I need to say anymore. That's just a fantastic card. The road building in cities and knights, people tend to focus a lot on, building up their commodities, building cities. Maybe they'll get to a port. But it's not like in base where there's kind of like 2, a balanced base game will have 2 players competing for army, 2 players competing for longest road. In cities and knights, I don't know the statistics for this, but I've played a lot of games, and there are so many games when someone just wins by building a 5th road at the very end because kind of no one's been paying attention to that. So road building, very strong card, especially you're not necessarily focused on building roads and opening new settlements a lot of the time. You're kind of focused on other parts of your game. Very strong card. And then the Alchemist, you choose the dice roll. I don't think I need to say a lot more on why that's a really good card. And so some general thoughts, like when the barbarians attack, and let's say you and another player or you and multiple other players have tied and defeated the barbarians, you get to choose a card from the deck. When you're taking that card, think about, what cards will help you the most and what cards will help you the least. And there's a few considerations. So I would say, for example, let's say you're on you're playing a very heavy ore wheat setup and you don't make a lot of roads. Taking a green card, especially if you're not already on the science track, might be a really good strategy, because road building is going to be a huge pull for you, and then irrigation and mining are going to be extra useful if you're on multiple hexes, right? So consider taking cards from progress tracks that you aren't active on. That's one. And then also just understand when, if you're taking like a green card, if you're not on ore, a mining, you might draw a mining, could be completely useless to you. So just like be cognizant of that. And I would say almost never you're going to want to take blue cards, but there are some exceptions. Like, if you've been tracking and you're getting close to the bottom of the blue deck and you want to pull that Constitution, or, someone's about to win and your only way to stop them is to pull a spy, or you're competing for longest road and you really need that intrigue or diplomat, it's possible that you might want to pull a blue card. I would say generally yellow is going to be the favorite, with green as a close second, and then blue not so often. And then my other kind of general tip is use them in combos. You have big turns with your cards. You don't want to spend 2 progress cards just to get 1 settlement. Usually, probably not the most efficient use of your time. There are exceptions, if it's a really great spot or you're plowing somebody and you're building roads to get there. But I've made this mistake myself. And you don't want a monopoly and merchant just to get this 1 settle that you were probably going to get next turn anyway. Save those for bigger turns. And I'm going to get more into that later. I'm going to have some tips for specific cards. But first, I actually want to talk about this order of operations for your card. And this is sort of to get the most out of things. If you do things in this order, there are some exceptions to this, but I'm going to talk about that. But I think generally, the first 4 in this, you're going to want to do in that order. I think the Saboteur is sort of where things get a little interesting. But for example, you don't want to play the Saboteur and then play a Monopoly because you're probably going to get less of what you wanted. So here, yeah, I think the Spy is the card you should use first. And the reason for that is, first of all, when you spy somebody, it's going to change your plans. You might have had an idea in your head of oh, I want to do this, I want to do that. And then you spy someone and hey, they have a road building. This sort of opens up a whole new world of possibilities for me, or they have a monopoly and you didn't have one. Now your whole plan changes. So use the spy first, right? And then the other thing is you can see what their plan might be, or what they're planning to do, and that might change what you want to do also. So spy first, always. Master Merchant is second because it kind of helps you recalibrate your tracking. You might say oh, I want to master merchant, you're master merchanting somebody and you also have a monopoly and you're oh, I'm going to take this from them and then I'm going to mono ore from everybody. But then when you master merchant them, you see, oh, they don't have any ore. Actually, wheat just rolled. Maybe I want a monopoly wheat. I see they have 2 wheat. I know the other players just rolled wheat. So it kind of helps you recalibrate your tracking. Also, again, similar to the spy, it lets you see your opponent's hand, see what they might be capable of, which might change your plan a little bit. Hey, maybe it's time for me to take this metropolis now because they're knocking on the door, right? So Master Merchant second. And then the next 2, I'd say Commodity Monopoly comes next because it's a little more forceful than the Commercial Harbor where your opponent can kind of choose what commodities to give to you. You want to take, everything of one commodity first and then give them fewer options. There's possible times if you use the Commercial Harbor first and the Commodity Monopoly second, you're going to get fewer cards out of that. So you want to do Commodity Monopoly first. And then I put Commercial Harbor and Resource Monopoly together because the order can change sometimes. So let's say, for example, you have 6 sheep in your hand and you play Commercial Harbor. You want to give a sheep to 3 players, get their commodities, and then you're going to monopoly those sheep and any extra sheep back, right? But you could also be in a scenario where you have barely any resources in your hand, but there's a lot of wheat out there. So you mono the wheat first, and then you play the Commercial Harbor and start handing the wheat back out. These are things just to consider. That order can kind of be interchangeable depending on the situation, so I put them together. Then next, I would say, is the Saboteur. This is after you've done taking the cards you really want. This is when you want people to kind of gut their hands and throw away stuff. And the reason you want to do it now is hey, if you play Saboteur, people are going to throw away the stuff they don't want, the cards that aren't as good. They're going to keep the good stuff. Then you play the Wedding, and they're oh, now I have a hard decision to make. I have to give him, or her, some of the harder cards, some of the cards I want more, and you're going to get better stuff. And the reason I put Wedding before playing the Bishop or using a Deserter to start a Knight bouncing chain or just bouncing and robbing people in general is because when you're robbing people and then you play the Wedding, they have some idea of what you got from them, and they'll have more information to try to give you cards that are less helpful to you. So I would say Wedding first because they'll have less info to go on, and then you start robbing them afterwards. Now, where this gets a little bit interesting with the Saboteur is sometimes players will be wise to what you're about to do. They can see you're about to start a bounce chain and start stealing from them. Okay, this guy played a Saboteur, I'm going to throw away all my commodities so he doesn't get any from me. Or he doesn't get any from me because that's what they want. That's what they really want. So you want to be a little cautious with the Saboteur. Sometimes people will be smart and throw away the cards that they think you're actually trying to get at. And also, if you're playing the wedding afterwards, let's say someone only has 2 cards, you want to play the wedding first probably, so you get both cards from them. If you play the Saboteur, they have to throw away 1. You only get 1 from them. So something to consider. I would say, like, generally you're going to want to follow this order, but as you play more games and have more experience, you'll understand when it makes sense to kind of deviate with the Saboteur and things of that nature. I think generally the first 4 you're going to want to do in that order. I think if you don't have a commercial harbor, obviously you can resource mono before you commodity mono. I don't think that matters. I want to talk about a few more order of operations tips. So, for example, if you're about to like build a settlement, you know, your turn starts, you have this settlement in hand, or you have a big city in hand, you're excited to build it. You know, hold your breath for a second, pause for a moment. Do you have a master merchant, a Saboteur, or a wedding that you can play? I've made this mistake many times. I've seen a lot of good players make this mistake from time to time. Just pause for a second. Make sure you have, if you have one of these cards, play it before gaining more points. Get the most out of it. My next tip is play an irrigation or mining after settling on a new wheat or hex. You're just going to get more cards out of it. You know, if you can save it for settling that next hex, do it. For the deserter, I've seen elite players make this mistake. I've seen players make this mistake. Make space for a new knight when you play that deserter. If you have 2 level 1 knights and you desert someone who has a level 1 knight, you're not getting the knight. Upgrade one of your knights. Make sure you have an empty road to place the knight on. Just a good tip in general. That's an order of operation. You know, make sure you have space. And then here are more of a couple like combos. So if you have both an intrigue and a deserter, and someone has a knight, say their weaker knight is on a hanging road where it can't go anywhere, you can intrigue and destroy that knight, and then play a deserter and get their stronger knight. Really powerful move to hurt an opponent. Maybe you can burn their city. Maybe you're just leaving them defenseless, and you can kind of like batter them with the robber after that. Very powerful combo, but again, you want to play that intrigue first so you can get the stronger knight with the deserter after. And then also, so here's another scenario I talked about a little bit before. If someone plows you with the knight, and then let's say they build a road. So they have one road, a knight on top of your road, and then another road. And sorry guys, I didn't have a ton of time to take a lot of screenshots of specific examples. So just gonna ask you to use your imagination for this one. It's important. If you have an intrigue and a diplomat, you can actually undo the plow and plow them. But you have to be careful. If you play your intrigue first, you'll actually kick their knight to the end of the road, and then you can't diplomat them. So what you want to do is play the diplomat first, take away that road, and then play the intrigue, and it will destroy their knight, and now you're free to build a knight or build a road and actually reverse that. And then the last one, and this is kind of like more of a cheeky little tip that I like to do. I don't know if this is generally regarded as best practice, but if you have an inventor and other greed cards went out, think about, you know, does anyone else have the inventor? Because the second inventor sort of gets the last laugh, so to speak. You know, maybe let's undo what you did, or maybe you'll take a good spot, but you'll have another good spot taken from you. So sometimes if I don't have a lot of progress cards in my hands and I have an inventor, maybe I'll wait in orbit and see if someone else plays one. And, you know, if they do, then I can play mine and sort of have the last laugh, so to speak. But again, this is like sort of up to your discretion. If you have a lot of progress cards and you don't think you're going to be able to hold it for a whole orbit, don't do this. Just play your inventor. Okay, and I want to move on to talking about some specific progress cards and like how to use them. Sorry, I need a sip of water there. So let's start with the spy. There's a lot to think about when you're using the spy. So who do you want to spy? Well, you want to spy players who are doing well, who are in the lead. You know, maybe they're close to winning the game, and you need to stop them from winning the game. Spying them, pretty important. Who else would you want to spy? Someone who has a lot of progress cards. Usually someone with a lot of yellow and green cards, but these cards are generally going to be the cards you want to advance your game. But maybe there are scenarios where you're looking for a specific blue card, or you think you might be trying to spy the spy. If they have some blue cards, go ahead, spy them. That's also something to consider. And then the last type of player I think you should spy is someone who's competing with you. Maybe you're racing for a Science Metropolis with somebody. Take away that extra progress card from them, and get the leg up, get ahead of them in that race. So then let's move on to what should you spy? Well, kind of the first rule of the spy is if they have a spy, you should take the spy. I think there's only one exception to this, and that exception is when there's a clear leader and you spy someone who's not the leader, which maybe you shouldn't have done that to begin with, but maybe you can agree, okay, I won't take your spy so that you'll spy them. That's the only exception I can see, and usually I think generally you should just agree to both spy the leader. But anyway, if someone has a spy, take their spy, and then if they have good cards, you can double dip. And if not, you can go fishing on somebody else. What else should you think about spying? If your opponent's close to winning, let's say they're on 11 points, and they have a merchant, they can play the merchant for 12, and they just need to build a settlement or a city to get to 13 and win the game. Take their merchant. That is a huge, huge way to stop them from winning the game. Let's say even if you have 2 merchants in your hand, and you don't need a merchant, you need to take that merchant from them to stop them from winning. You can't afford to make that mistake of allowing them that opportunity. Now, you do want to consider maybe they have 2 merchants, and nobody else has a spy. Taking one of their merchants isn't really going to do anything. See what else they have. They have a road building, an alchemist, a resource monopoly. Take that instead. If you can't stop them from playing a merchant, take the other card. That's going to help you instead. And then lastly, if your opponent's not super far ahead or they don't have a spy, just take the best card for you. Take what helps you the most. Now, there is a caveat to this. If there's 2 cards that help you about the same, consider taking the card that helps your opponent more. So let's say your opponent, you spy them, they have a mining and irrigation. Not a mining and irrigation, I'm sorry. A mining and a medicine. And for you, you're on 1 ore hex. These 2 cards are very similar in value for you. They're going to help you city up just about the same. But your opponent's not on any ore hexes. Well, leave them with the mining then, because it's useless in their hand, and you can still use the medicine to about equal usage for you. It's just about as good. So just something to consider there. And then when should you use the spy? Well, I'd say usually you want to use it right away. If other blue cards went out, your spy might get spied. You don't want to hang on to it for too long. But I will say, if no one else is generating blue cards, you're the only one who has a blue card and can make blue cards. And there's not many progress cards out there. Maybe one person has 1 yellow card, and you don't want to take a merchant fleet from them if that's what they have. You can consider holding your spy for a little bit. I think it's a strategy to wait for there to be a few more cards out there for you to have kind of better odds of pulling a card that's good for you. Anyway, that's all with the spy. I'm going to go on to the merchant. Again, this is probably the most useful card for finishing, and it's also very useful in the beginning of the game. So some key tips: use the merchant in tandem with resource monopoly to help burst ahead on progress tracks or build cities. Have nice turns. If you monopoly 6 cards and you play the merchant, well, maybe you can get the aqueduct there. And then also it's good with irrigation or mining if you're on multiple wheat or ore hexes. It kind of just leads to explosive turns where you can use a lot of resources to do one thing. I will say, generally, you want to avoid using the merchant for just 1 usage. There's a lot of merchants in the deck, so you might use it once, and then it gets taken from you right away, and you didn't really get a whole lot out of it. Now, there are some exceptions to this. I think, in the early game, if you really need to use your merchant to build that knight to save your city, or you're just trying to get on a commodity track in the early game, and that's a long-term investment, I think these are pretty viable reasons to use it 2-to-1. There could be other reasons, if it's a really powerful settle spot that you're plowing somebody, it can make sense. But I would say generally you're gonna want to only put down the merchant when you're using it for more than 1 2-to-1 port usage. And then again, save your merchant for important turns. You don't want to use your merchant on this 1 2-to-1 and then it gets taken from you, and then the next orbit, you pulled a resource monopoly and you could have gotten the aqueduct or could have gotten a metropolis or could have had the win, even if you had saved your merchant. So consider using your merchant. Don't be too quick on the trigger. Sometimes it's good to hold it a little bit because you'll have a better moment to use it. And again, something I talked about before, if you intend to perform moves using cards like Wedding or you think one of your opponents has a wedding or a master merchant, like maybe hang on to your merchant a little bit and kind of like duck being targeted by those cards and also allow yourself to use those cards. Okay. Moving on to a couple of the other big cards that I was talking about, the Alchemist, the Road Builder. The Alchemist is an incredible card. You decide the dice roll, use it in combo with other cards. Kind of set up that turn. You can plan your turn in advance when you have an Alchemist. You know what you're going to roll, or you know what you might roll. So if you have the Aqueduct and you know you're going to roll your 6 wood, Aqueduct a brick. Think about that. And then use it in conjunction with Monopolies. You can use a roll that generates a lot of cards for the board, and then monopoly those cards. Maybe it'll help you get a Metropolis. Maybe it'll just like help you double city or something. Like it's really good to use in combo, especially with monopolies, I would say. But you can even combo that with like other cards, irrigation, mining, etc. And then save your Alchemist for a good time. If your best roll is blocked, you don't really want to use the Alchemist to roll a 7 to open up your best roll. Like there are circumstances when that might be the right move. But I would say in general, save it for when you know you can roll that money roll, right? Because that's really going to help you kind of secure those big turns, set yourself up for the win, or maybe even just win the game in general. It's a really strong card at the very end to kind of decide the game. And then for the road building, one of my tips is make your road longer. The longest road is often very vulnerable in cities and knights, and road building might be just decide who gets it. It's tempting sometimes to just drop a road to each side and open up 2 settle spots. And if you're not in contention for longest road, very viable strategy. But one of my tips is just, look, the road is usually vulnerable in C&K. If you can make your road longer, even if you're only opening 1 settle spot, consider it. And then try to secure more space. Sometimes you can like build 2 roads and you're cutting somebody off, and maybe you're only opening 1 settlement, but you're sort of opening up this part of the board that no one else is on. Use that. Get some space for yourself. That helps with longest road competition, opens up more settle spots for you down the line. Just kind of a good usage in general. And then another thing to be careful of is, in the base game, there's no way to remove roads, right? But in Cities and Knights, there's a diplomat card where your roads can be removed. So be a little cautious about playing your road building before you can settle. Maybe you play your road building and then you get diplomated and you have to rebuild one of those roads. Whereas if you waited a turn, you would have had the settlement in hand, you could have road building settled, and you don't have to worry about that. So that's just something to consider when it comes to the road building card. Okay, moving on. A little more specific tips for some cards. If you have a master merchant, you can extort people. Let's say you're getting close to the aqueduct and you need a paper, and you know one of your opponents has a paper, and you can master merchant them. But you don't think they're actually the leader, you think someone else is. You can tell them, hey, look, for my own game, I really need the aqueduct. I can master merchant you, but I really only want the 1 paper. I don't want any other card from you. I would rather master merchant the leader, and you trade me this paper. In fact, maybe I can give you one of the cards that I master merchant from them for your paper, and I'll keep the other one, and we can work out a deal. And I think a lot of people are open to this. Sometimes people won't be open to it, but it's definitely a strategy you can try. And it's similarly, you can threaten to burn someone's city and extort them that way, and get something out of them. You can also give people insurance from your saboteur. Let's say, you think someone is doing okay, but they're not like really killing it, and they have a wood, and you really need a wood to kind of like settle or something. You can say, hey, look, you have 10 cards. I'm about to play the saboteur. You're going to have to discard 5 of them. I'll make you a deal. If you give me one of your woods, I'll hold the rest of your cards for you, play the saboteur, and you only lose 1 wood. It's a good deal for both of us. They might not accept it, but it's an idea. It's something to consider that you could try. And then another thing that I think is very important is be mindful of the card bank, when playing cards like Alchemist, Irrigation, or Mining. I've seen someone play the Alchemist on a roll and get no cards and lose the game because of that. Think about the card bank. I've also seen twice in this past week people played the Irrigation when there wasn't very much wheat left, and they didn't get as much wheat as they should have. So my tip for the Alchemist is think about rolling something else. And for the Irrigation or Mining, start, like, let's say you have a merchant on your wheat, and you're going to irrigate for 6 more wheat, and you're going to have like a big turn. When you have your merchant on that wheat, start porting your wheat first. Port all your wheat first, then play the Irrigation. That way you're not going to trigger the bank card limit, and you're going to be able to use the cards to the maximum. And then another tip, if you think you're competing for longest road in the late game, hold on to that diplomat or hold on to that intrigue for the right time, because these cards are kind of sneaky. They're very situational, and a lot of times during the game they're not that helpful. But in these end games where you need to destroy someone's knight to take road, or just like take one of their roads away, like they can be absolutely like the game-changing card that you need. Kind of hold on to them near the end if you think that you might be in that position where one of them can help you. And then the last piece of progress cards that I want to talk about is pacing. So sometimes when you're in the lead, you're targeted. People are robbing you, people are spying you, people are trying to plow you, trying to steal your metropolis. And when this is all happening, you're not necessarily going to be in that position to kind of wait for the perfect moment to use your cards always. Sometimes you need to just pull the trigger and start using some cards, even if it's not like the perfect moment, just so you can progress, because people are trying to stop you. And if it hurts other players, like if you're monoing or just the city up once in the end game, like that's a pretty good play. But it could be like, you could be monoing or and then porting it all to settle, which doesn't seem like a great play, but you're hurting your opponent and they're trying to slow you down. And sometimes if you're too passive, you may end up waiting for a moment that never comes, and you'll actually have to throw away some progress cards that you could have been using. So I'm often a big advocate for being efficient with your cards, but if you're being targeted in the lead, sometimes you need to just pull the trigger here and there to kind of make sure you're still moving forward. And then kind of the flip side of that is you don't want to use up all your progress cards and resources just to top out at 10 or 11 points. You're painting a massive target on your back, and then people are going to start robbing you, colluding against you, trying to take away your metropolis or your road or whatever. And you don't have any progress cards to fight back. You don't have any resources to kind of defend yourself. You might get your city burned. There's a lot of things that could happen. Consider instead, not using that last progress card and the last 5 resources, and stop at 8 or 9 points and kind of leave yourself a little bit of fuel in the tank so that the next turn you can kind of move along a little more and you still have some stuff to fight back. And so you have a little bit of fuel to kind of make that push for the finish line. Because if you sort of top out at 10 or 11 or even 12 points, you might have just cost yourself the game if your opponents know what they're doing and if you don't get lucky. So that's just something to consider. And then this last piece I wanted to talk about a little bit, just some commodities and general strategies. I'm not talking about progress cards anymore. This is the last topic of the class. And this is kind of going to be pretty brief. So the first thing, one of my tips is get on level 1 of all 3 progress tracks and try to do this early. And I think this was in like a Tricosaurus video or something, so shout out to him. The odds of drawing a progress card are better for like each of the first levels. So when you upgrade your commodity level 1 on a track, the dice roll 1 or 2 on the red die and the subsequent event die roll can give you a progress card. No other upgrade gives you 2 dice rolls from it. So for example, let's say you're upgraded on the trade track and you're on level 2, right? You're actually less likely to roll a progress card than someone who's upgraded on level 1 on both trade and politics. They're more likely to draw a card than you. So getting on level 1 of all 3 tracks, super important. And something to consider, and obviously this is going to be game to game, there's sort of a strategy a lot of people like to employ, which is like rush the aqueduct. Just go for aqueduct, pour all your resources into getting the aqueduct as early as possible. Good strategy. Aqueduct is super powerful. Only try to get your aqueduct. Ignore getting on that yellow track. In fact, maybe if you use some of your resources to get a cloth, that cloth might lead to you drawing a card that helps faster. So it's something to think of. Obviously, there are games where aqueduct before I've even upgraded level 1 cloth, but I find I have more success when I kind of get level 1 yellow and green first and then start going for aqueduct. And I wouldn't discount getting on level 1 blue. There are some really useful cards in that progress track as well. And then with the aqueduct, just to talk about it a little more, obviously extremely powerful tool at your disposal. Be purposeful with your aqueduct. Let's say you're on a 6 brick and every time it rolls you get 3 brick. Maybe on your turns when it's not your turn and you're aqueducting cards, take a wood. And instead of like alternating taking a wood, then taking a brick, wood, taking a brick, take 3 woods in a row, you know, kind of anticipating your 6th brick is going to roll, and now you have 3 roads, right? You know, set yourself up in that way. You can also work together to collude with people. Let's say there's one player who's like very far, and the rest of the table is colluding against them. Maybe your player A, and you know you need to feed player C the road. So player A and player B both have aqueduct. You say, hey, this card rolled. I'm going to take a wood from the aqueduct. You take a brick. We're going to trade them both to player C so they can get the road or get the plow or whatever. You can also aqueduct cards to help with metro steals and so forth. And another thing to consider is, like, are yellow cards rolling a lot? Are people, you know, monoing a lot of cards? Did like a ton of wheat just roll, and there's a lot of yellow cards out there? Maybe you don't want to take a wheat from the aqueduct and get monoed. Maybe you have a sheep port and you take a sheep instead, and you're kind of playing it safe there. Like, and maybe that card, you know, I think mistakes with the aqueduct, a lot of times it's not necessarily a mistake because you don't know what's going to roll or how the game flow is going to happen. But these little kind of micro decisions add up, and it could be the difference between you having the win in hand and being a card off. So it's just something to think about. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is the trading house. It's an underrated bonus. It's not as good as aqueduct. I'm not going to tell you that, but it's really strong, and people kind of underestimate how good it is. Like, if you have the trade Metropolis and no one's really pushing for it, every 2 cloth you make is a free card, and you can do whatever you want with it. It's really good for, I would say the trade track is the best track to be on for, like, if you want flexibility to fight for other metros. Like, so let's say you have the trade metro and, you know, no one's really that close to politics. You start turning all your cloth into coins. You can start, you know, you're drawing maybe more monopolies and merchants than everyone else too, and you can start porting all your sheep or wheat into those as well. It's generally just like a very flexible ability to be able to trade your commodities at 2-to-1. And I'm actually going to give you a really good example. So the commercial harbor is generally, it's like a pretty good card in the beginning of the game, but at the end of the game, when it's sort of hard to track like what scraps of commodities people have left over once a lot of the metro tussles have been settled. And if you have trading house, it kind of just opens the door for you a lot more. Like, let's say you have a cloth and a paper in your hand and you play the commercial harbor. Well, maybe you'll get a cloth and a paper from somebody else, and now you have, like, you can port those 2-to-1, and having 2-to-1 service is, like, incredible. So this example I'm going to talk about, actually. So I played a Catan game. It was with Cat the Hat, Sammy Hammy, and PW True. I actually did not do well in that game, but it is an illustration of how powerful the trading house is. Sammy was very close to winning the game. Her best way to win was to take road. She couldn't do it, but she had a commercial harbor. And she actually got the commodities she needed to 2-to-1 to steal the road. And I've been in many, many scenarios at the end of the game where having trading house was just so clutch for me being able to get down the settle that I needed, or the city, or you know, steal a metro, or what have you. Super underrated. And it just also, it really synergizes well with the yellow cards in the deck, whether it's commercial harbor or commodity monopoly or just you're drawing a lot of monos and merchants. Anyway, that is it for this class. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you found it insightful. I believe this recording will be up later, so if you missed it or there's things you want to review, you'll be able to do that. But yeah, again, thank you all, and if you have any questions, I'm going to hang out for a little bit at the end. We can talk strategy. I'm happy to do that. But yeah, thanks.
That was awesome.